Chapter 1. Death in the Snow. It had snowed quietly through the night in St. Mary Mead, the sort of snow that hushed the world and coated even the sharpest corners in a soft white glow. The village, always picturesque with its ivy-covered cottages and twisting lanes, now looked like a scene from one of those vintage Christmas cards kept in a tin box beneath the stair. Wreaths adorned every shop door, the air held the tang of pine, roasted chestnuts, and faint wood smoke, and the village square had been transformed into a glittering Christmas market, its stalls decked with ribbons, mistletoe, and twinkling fairy lights, all set under a canopy of falling snow. It was the kind of morning where even the most cynical might believe in magic. Or perhaps, murder. The annual market had drawn a larger crowd this year, no doubt owing to the efforts of Henry Ditchley, the new market organizer. Henry was a robust, talkative man with a neatly clipped mustache, and a habit of wearing cravats in curious colors. He had come to St. Mary Mead only 6 months prior, and had quickly appointed himself to various committees and boards. He was the sort who made things happen, often stepping on long-set traditions in the process. Though many appreciated the new life he brought to the sleepy village, a good number of the locals whispered about his manner, his meddling, his temper, and how he'd closed the old toymaker's stall in favor of a more modern vendor. But on that morning, with snowflakes swirling like powdered sugar and carolers singing on the green, most had set those feelings aside. Until, of course, Henry Ditchley was found dead. It happened just as the clock on the chapel tower struck 11. The market was in full swing. Children were laughing, scarves wrapped tight around rosy cheeks, and couples lingered over cinnamon buns and steaming mugs of cider. It was Mrs. Grover, the baker's wife, who let out the first scream. She had gone to fetch a cup of mulled wine from the stall near the center of the market, a place festooned with holly garlands and paper lanterns. And instead of the cheerful vendor, she found Henry Ditchley sprawled behind the counter, his face drained of color, eyes wide open, and one gloved hand clenched into a rigid fist. There was a shattered mug on the ground, its contents staining the snow like blood, and a twisted garland hanging where someone, or something, had disturbed it. Panic rippled through the crowd like a dropped stone in water. Within moments, the music stopped, voices rose, and the market descended into a mix of shock and confusion. But from the window of a modest thatched cottage just beyond the square, Miss Marple had seen something no one else had. Jane Marple, long retired from London life and content in her observations of village comings and goings, had been sipping her mid-morning tea, a delicate Darjeeling with one slice of lemon, and watching the crowd from her chair by the fire. She always said people revealed far more of themselves in moments of supposed joy than in grief. And on that morning, just moments before the scream, she noticed a figure slip down the alley behind the mulled wine stall, swift, purposeful, and oddly composed amid the festive cheer. The figure moved quickly, head down, wrapped in a dark coat, and was gone by the time the crowd surged toward the scene of the crime. What struck Miss Marple was not just the speed with which the person had left, but the timing. Whoever it was had left before the scream, before the body had been publicly discovered. It was as if they already knew what would be found. The constable, young and a touch overeager, was quickly on the scene. He cordoned off the stall and took hurried statements from the nearest vendors. But Miss Marple did not rush out like the others. No, she sipped the last of her tea, rose quietly, and fetched her shawl. A murder had occurred in her village, during her favorite time of year, and from the looks of it, the killer was already slipping away, under cover of snow and song. As the constable fussed and the crowd whispered, several villagers began voicing theories. A robbery gone wrong. An allergic reaction. Too much brandy and not enough breakfast. But Miss Marple thought otherwise. For Henry Ditchley had not simply collapsed. The positioning of the body was wrong, too rigid and arranged as if placed. His gloved hand was burnt slightly, the leather curled at the fingertips, though no flame was nearby. A curious thing. And the garland above the stall, normally hung high and secure, was drooping, as though someone had pulled on it recently, perhaps to steady themselves or to cover their movements. Miss Marple had learned long ago to look not at what was present, but at what was missing. And what was missing, she soon discovered, was the market's charity tin, a small brass box meant to collect coins for the church's winter fund. She remembered it well because just the day before, Henry had argued with Clarissa Cray about who should oversee the money. Clarissa, a widow known more for her tongue than her tact, had wanted the funds redirected to the animal shelter. Henry had firmly disagreed. The tin was supposed to be under the mulled wine stall's counter. Now it was nowhere to be seen. She wandered the square slowly, making her way around the perimeter rather than cutting through the chaos. She passed Mr. Bellamy's closed toymaker stall, once the pride of the market, now locked and dusty. He had been none too pleased when Henry revoked his spot this year, citing safety issues with his hand-carved rocking horses. She also passed young Tom Fletcher's bakery stall, where Tom stood pale and stammering, his apron dusted with flour and hands shaking as he served gingerbread to an uninterested customer. Tom had always been fond of Henry's niece, Eloise, and had grown bitter when Henry disapproved of their courtship. So many motives, Miss Marple mused. So many secrets tucked neatly beneath scarves and smiles. She paused beside the candle stall, where the scents of clove, cinnamon, and beeswax mingled in the air. A single wax taper had been knocked over and crushed underfoot. Strange, she thought, that such a thing would go unnoticed. Stranger still that Henry's glove had been burnt, as if he had held something hot, or had it been placed thereafter. The pieces were there, scattered like ornaments fallen from a tree. And like any good puzzle, it required patience. Miss Marple would wait, observe, listen to the gossip and the gaps between stories. The truth always had a way of showing itself, especially when people believed they were no longer being watched. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the village in a false sense of peace. But for Miss Marple, the game had already begun. And somewhere, not far from the market square, someone was warming their hands beside a fire, believing they had committed the perfect crime. Not realizing, of course, that someone had seen them flee before anyone had screamed. Who was the shadowy figure, and why did they flee before anyone screamed? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in what was found, but in what had quietly vanished from the snow. Chapter 2. A village full of secrets. The snow had not yet stopped falling by the time the news of Henry Ditchley's death reached every hearth in St. Mary Mead. The village, quaint and tight-knit as it was, had a way of carrying gossip faster than a telegraph wire. Within the hour, kettles were boiling, curtains were twitching, and conversations were shifting from recipes and weather to far darker speculations. For although Henry's death was sudden and alarming, what set it apart? What made it far more than a tragic accident, was the slow, unmistakable realization that someone in their very midst had wanted it to happen. And in a place as small as St. Mary Mead, that was more chilling than any frost. The Christmas market had always been the pride of the village. A gentle, modest affair in years past, it was known for its handmade ornaments, spiced cider, and the delicate lace angels stitched by the vicar's wife. Stalls were passed down like heirlooms, each one bearing the history of the families who ran them. For decades it had been as predictable as the snow that dusted its rooftops and the carols sung beneath the gas lamps. But this year had been different. This year, it was Henry's market. Henry Ditchley had arrived from Cheltenham the spring before, renting the old Harwood cottage near the woods and joining the parish council with an enthusiasm that both impressed and unnerved. He was not unlikable, on the contrary, his charm was practiced and persuasive, but he had a way of taking over, of brushing aside long-standing customs with the cheerful air of someone doing others a favor. When he was made chairman of the Christmas Market Committee, the decision had been met with polite applause and private alarm. And by December, that alarm had proven warranted. Gone were the beloved but rickety stalls of the local craftsmen. In their place stood uniform kiosks Henry had sourced from a firm in town, complete with red roofs and battery-powered fairy lights. Stall fees had doubled, justified by the promise of modernization. Vendors who couldn't meet the new rates were replaced with outside sellers offering fancy wares, candied nuts in foil wrappers, imported toys, and artisanal cheese of a sort no one in the village could pronounce. For the first time, several St. Mary Mead residents found themselves priced out of their own market. Resentment took root, disguised under smiles, and many simply stopped attending committee meetings altogether. Others seethed quietly and vowed to reclaim their stalls next year. And yet, not everyone was opposed to Henry's changes. Some, like Eloise Ditchley, his niece and only local kin, thrived under the new order. A sharp-minded girl of 24 with a love of fashionable hats and a flair for bookkeeping, Eloise had been given the role of assistant treasurer, a position she claimed was voluntary, but which came with more access to the market funds than most had ever had. Then there was young Tom Fletcher, a baker with more ambition than experience, who had managed to snag a prime corner stall once held by old Mrs. Gibbons, who'd been selling plum pudding there for 30 years. Tom had been heard more than once praising Henry's vision, though others muttered it had more to do with Henry allowing him proximity to Eloise, whom he had been courting with warm mince pies and shy smiles. Clarissa Cray, on the other hand, had taken the changes personally. A widow of some notoriety, known for her sharp tongue and fondness for sherry before noon, Clarissa had run the Christmas market's charity raffle since the late 1980s. Her stall, always placed beside the chapel gate, had been unceremoniously moved to a less visible spot by the public lavatories, a decision she called an assassination of her dignity. She'd argued publicly with Henry at the final committee meeting before the event, her voice rising to such a pitch that several chairs were scraped backward. She claimed he had misallocated raffle proceeds to a fund no one had heard of, and she made no secret of her intention to report it to the vicar. Whether she followed through, no one could say. Then there was Mr. Bellamy, the toymaker. A gentle, stooped man with thick spectacles and a limp that grew worse in the cold, Bellamy had handcrafted wooden toys for over 40 years, each one painted with love and precision. He was adored by the village children, and his stall, painted blue and lined with straw, had become a symbol of the market itself. But Henry had closed it this year, citing health and safety concerns. Something about sharp corners and untested varnish. Bellamy hadn't fought it, not outwardly. He simply locked his workroom and stopped answering the door. Miss Marple, of course, had noticed. She noticed everything. All around the square, stories like these echoed. Shifts in position, losses in profit, bruised egos and upturned traditions. In a town where routine was the mortar that held life together, Henry had been a hammer. And now that hammer lay still, its hand gloved and burned, its body cooling under a garland that had once symbolized joy. Miss Marple walked through the square slowly that afternoon, her footsteps silent on the snow, her eyes flicking from stall to stall with a gaze far sharper than her soft wool hat would suggest. She greeted vendors kindly but lingered only briefly. She was not there for cheer or for shopping. She was collecting impressions, measuring silences, noting who looked her in the eye and who didn't. The constable, still young and burdened by the solemnity of his first murder scene, was conducting interviews in the parish hall. But Miss Marple preferred to gather her facts where truth lived, in between the lines of conversation, in the small tremors of guilt or resentment that most tried hard to hide. Who, she wondered, gained the most from Henry's death? Certainly, Eloise now held unchecked access to the market funds. Tom Fletcher, without Henry's disapproving eye, might more freely pursue his affection. Clarissa Cray might see her beloved Raffle return to its place of honor, her pride restored. And Bellamy, well, Miss Marple could not ignore the pain in his eyes when children passed by without stopping. He had lost more than a stall, he had lost his place. But motives were rarely so clean. People lied, but not always for themselves. They covered for others, sometimes out of love, sometimes out of fear. And in Miss Marple's experience, murder was often committed not in rage but in desperation. Someone, she felt certain, had been pushed too far. And someone else knew it. As the daylight dimmed and gas lamps flickered to life, the village square took on a different quality, beautiful, yes, but also strangely hollow. The laughter of earlier hours had given way to cautious whispers. Children were kept close, and the scent of roasting nuts no longer seemed quite so sweet. A darkness had settled beneath the snow, not visible but felt. And at its center stood the stall with the garland still drooping slightly, the stain on the ground refusing to fade, no matter how many handfuls of snow were brushed over it. The market would continue, of course. The show must go on. But Miss Marple knew that something had shifted in St. Mary Mead. The warmth of tradition had been pierced by a single, cold act. And as she looked once more toward the alley where the shadowy figure had vanished that morning, she tightened her shawl and made a mental note. Secrets, like footprints in snow, may seem to disappear, but they never really do. Not in a village this small. If you're enjoying the twists, the clues, and the quiet brilliance of Miss Marple's mind, don't forget to subscribe. New mysteries arrive each week, some cozy, some chilling, but always with a clever twist waiting at the end. Tap subscribe now, and become part of the case before the next clue disappears. Chapter 3. The suspects assemble. By the next morning, the snow had begun to harden, forming icy ridges along the cobbled paths of St. Mary Mead, the once soft powder now stiffening beneath the boots of villagers making their way, cautiously, to the heart of the square. Though the Christmas market had reopened under a hushed and uneasy atmosphere, the cheer had thinned like breath on frosted glass. There were no carols that morning, only murmurs. The mulled wine stall remained closed, cordoned off with a length of thick twine, and a handwritten sign in the constable's untidy scrawl, "Under investigation, do not enter." But human nature, curious, compulsive, and easily bored, needed something to occupy itself, and so the villagers, no longer satisfied with idle speculation, had begun to arrange the cast of suspects themselves. Miss Marple, of course, had started far earlier. For her, identifying suspects was never about theatrics or gossip, but about understanding motive, opportunity, and the barely visible threads that ran between people: envy, resentment, greed, fear. The truth of a murder often lay in plain sight, not in what someone did, but in how they reacted once it had been done. So it was that she found herself that morning, wrapped in her warmest tweed coat, and a woolen scarf the shade of faded lavender, standing at the edge of the market and quietly assembling a mental sketch of 5 individuals, each with cause, each with secrets, and each playing their part on the snowy stage before her. First, there was Mr. Edwin Bellamy, the aging toymaker, whose presence at the market was ghostly now, more memory than man. His once bustling stall, painted a cheerful robin's egg blue and decked with tiny garlands, stood empty beside the sweet stall. The shutters were drawn and the sign, Bellamy's Handcrafted Joys, faded at the corners. Children, who once flocked to his rocking horses and whirring wooden animals, now passed by without a glance. Mr. Bellamy himself was rarely seen these days, save for a glimpse through the fogged glass of his workshop window. Henry Ditchley had closed his stall just weeks prior, citing new safety regulations that required certifications Mr. Bellamy could not afford. It had devastated him, not just financially but personally. For Bellamy, the market was not a profit-making scheme, it was tradition, legacy, identity. And now it was gone. A man like that, thought Miss Marple, might nurse a quiet rage. Not the theatrical sort that lashes out in the open, but the slow, simmering kind that can surprise even itself. Then came Clarissa Cray, the widow. A short, sharp woman with a collection of hats more varied than her moods. That morning she wore a green felt one with a pheasant feather tucked just above the brim, which bobbed dramatically as she moved from stall to stall, offering her unsolicited insights to any willing ear. She had been seen arguing with Henry Ditchley just 3 days before the murder, her voice rising high above the bric-a-brac of the council meeting room, accusing him of redirecting the charity raffle proceeds away from the church's winter relief fund. Clarissa had run the raffle for years and took great pride in its transparency. Whether or not her accounting skills matched that pride was up for debate. Still, having her authority questioned had not sat well. She had been publicly humiliated, and her pride had taken a battering she had not attempted to hide. He thought he could do better, she'd said after the meeting, loud enough for half the village to hear. Let's see how well he manages without a conscience. Dramatic words in hindsight, perhaps too dramatic. But it's often those who shout loudest who hide the least, and Miss Marple wondered whether Clarissa's temper was too obvious, too broadcast, to truly be dangerous. A subtler suspect stood across the market beside the bakery cart, his apron still dusted with flour, his hat pulled low over his brow. Tom Fletcher, young and eager, was the village's newest baker, and had once held great hopes for the market. He had secured a spot last year through sheer charm and an abundance of croissants, but this year, despite his growing popularity, his permit had been mysteriously revoked just days before the opening. Henry had later reinstated it, citing a clerical error, but the damage had been done. Tom had scrambled to reassemble his stall, losing 2 days of trade and several key suppliers. Some said he took it in stride, but Miss Marple had noted the tightness around his jaw, the way he spoke through clenched teeth when Henry's name was mentioned. More curious still was his attachment to Eloise Ditchley, Henry's niece. They were often seen talking in low tones by the chapel steps, their heads bent close together. Some whispered of a romance, others of a business arrangement. Either way, Tom's fortunes rose and fell in tandem with Henry's whims, a dangerous position for any man to be in. Then there was Eloise herself, Eloise Ditchley, young, poised, and unerringly composed for someone whose only living relative had just died under suspicious circumstances. She wore a long red coat with brass buttons and a matching beret, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her as she walked through the square, offering polite condolences and steady, level-eyed answers to every question. She had been appointed assistant treasurer of the market by Henry himself, a position that gave her intimate access to the event's finances and records. And now, with Henry gone, she inherited not only his home, but potentially his authority on the council. She had motive in spades, financial, social, and perhaps even personal. But what struck Miss Marple most was how calm she appeared. Not the quiet composure of grief, but something else. Something practiced. Finally, there was Margot Thistle, the church's charity organizer. A brisk, bespectacled woman with a clipboard always at the ready, Margot was the engine behind the winter relief program, the orphan shoe drive, and the annual Warm Coats for Widows appeal. She took her role seriously, and with a certain missionary zeal. Henry, however, had recently challenged her handling of the donation collections, suggesting at a meeting that the funds were not entirely accounted for, a veiled accusation that left Margot flushed and speechless. The donation tin, usually secured at her stall, had gone missing the same day Henry was killed. And while Margot claimed she had handed it off for safekeeping, no one seemed to know who had received it. Her tall frame, bright orange scarf, and severe expression made her hard to miss, and harder still to trust implicitly. Margot was not one to be taken lightly, Miss Marple thought. Behind her righteous efficiency could easily lurk something far more desperate. Each of them, in their way, had motive. Each of them had history with Henry Ditchley that went beyond casual acquaintance. And while the village watched and whispered, Miss Marple stood quietly in the center of it all, her eyes flitting from face to face like a librarian scanning the spines of well-worn novels. She wasn't interested in the loudest voices or the grandest gestures. She was looking for a flicker, a misstep, a contradiction, a silence that lasted just a moment too long. For it is in the small things, always the small things, that the truth is tucked away. By midday, the constable had assembled a preliminary report, but it was full of guesses and gaps. Miss Marple, however, had already assembled something far more useful, a mental tableau of suspects. A toymaker wronged, a widow enraged, a baker humiliated, a niece composed, and a charity worker questioned. And though she could not yet say who had done it, she knew the pieces were beginning to form a picture. All she had to do now was wait. Wait for someone to slip, to reveal more than they intended, or to underestimate the eyes of an old woman who had seen far more in her lifetime than most ever would. And so the market carried on, the snow continued to fall, and beneath the garlands and wreaths, a quiet tension hummed like an off-note in a Christmas carol. 5 suspects. 5 motives. But only one gained the most. Who do you trust least, and why? Chapter 4. The clue in the candle wax. The snow had begun to thaw, ever so slightly, as the pale winter sun struggled through a veil of cloud the morning after Henry Ditchley's death. The cheerful lights of the Christmas market, though still glowing in the early hours, now shimmered with a subdued melancholy. The laughter that once echoed through the square had been replaced by hushed conversations, and a layer of unease now clung to the village like mist rising from a frozen pond. But while most of St. Mary Mead resumed their routines with quiet dread, pretending, as humans often do, that horror can be soothed by habit, Miss Marple took her shawl from the peg, selected her most sensible boots, and stepped into the mystery with the kind of calm resolve that comes only from age and the certainty that truth, however deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. She made her way to the scene of the crime in the early light, moving deliberately, allowing her mind to wander over what she had seen, what she had overheard, and most importantly, what had not been said. The mulled wine stall was still roped off with twine, its faded, closed for the season, sign fluttering in the breeze like a white flag. But Miss Marple was not one to be hindered by appearances. She paused just outside the boundary, eyes narrowing slightly as they scanned the scene, with the cool detachment of a reader revisiting a passage for a missed clue. There was something about the way Henry had been found that troubled her, beyond the unnatural stillness of death, beyond even the timing of the scream, and the mysterious figure that had slipped away down the alley. No, it was the details that lingered in her mind. The curious twist of Henry's body, the unnatural angle of his hand, and the faint but distinct scorch mark on the leather glove that adorned it. That glove was not new. She remembered Henry wearing it at the last council meeting, but the burn was. The leather, once supple and brown, now puckered and blackened at the fingertips. Miss Marple had seen that sort of damage before, not from fire, but from hot wax. She had spent enough time in village churches, watching altar boys light candles with trembling hands, to know that molten wax burns hot and fast. And Henry Ditchley, whatever his faults, had not been the type to clumsily dip his fingers in candle flame. She moved closer now, crouching slightly, not so low that she would draw attention, but just enough to inspect the area around where the body had lain. The ground had been trampled by curious onlookers, but just beneath the edge of the garland, half hidden by a patch of still untouched snow, she spotted something glinting faintly. She brushed the snow aside gently, revealing the shattered remains of a Christmas ornament, a silver bell, the kind often sold at the candle stall 2 kiosks down. Its edges were jagged, the surface cracked and scorched. Curious. There was no fire at the mulled wine stall. No heater, no flame, not even a lantern. So what had caused the damage? Her attention turned instinctively toward the candle stall, now being run by a nervous-looking teenage boy with more enthusiasm than attention to detail. The stall had once been run by old Mrs. Peyton, but she had taken ill earlier in the week, and her grandson had stepped in. The candles were arranged in neat rows, each tied with ribbon, some beeswax, some scented, a few novelty items shaped like angels or pine cones. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she examined them from a distance. She had purchased a few over the years and knew that the silver bells were often used to decorate gift boxes for larger orders, special, festive touches that customers appreciated. She also knew that the candles were molded by hand in the back of the shop, and that the wax, hot and unwieldy, was poured fresh each morning. A movement at her elbow startled her. A small boy, no more than 7, had tugged at her coat. He was chewing a peppermint and looking half scared, half excited, the way children often did when they had something important to share. "Miss," he mumbled, "I saw Mr. Ditchley yesterday. Before he, you know." He paused, uncertain whether he was supposed to continue. Miss Marple lowered herself slightly, her expression gentle but encouraging. "He was walking toward the candle stall," the boy continued, "but he told the men not to follow. Said he'd meet someone alone." The boy blinked. He looked real serious. "I was waiting for me mum near the toy horse when I heard him." Now that was interesting. Henry, seen heading toward the candle stall alone, requesting not to be followed. And shortly after, found dead at the mulled wine stall. The distance between the two wasn't far, a few paces, perhaps, but just enough time for a confrontation to occur in privacy, just enough space for a hand to pass something over. A poisoned drink. A threatening note. Or perhaps something more subtle, more ceremonial. Miss Marple thanked the child, offered him a boiled sweet from her pocket, and turned her gaze back to the now silent stall with its array of candles. She moved closer, under the pretense of admiring a display. Her hand brushed against the small brass tray beside the register, and there she saw it, a tiny smear of reddish wax, still slightly tacky to the touch. Not the pinky beige of the regular tapers, but something deeper, more dramatic. She remembered the stain on Henry's glove again. A match. The wax had transferred. But from what? Then she saw it, tucked behind a row of boxed votives, half obscured by a tin of pine-scented tealites. A candle, larger than the others, decorated with a band of holly, and a single silver bell hanging from a ribbon around its base. The bell was identical to the broken one near Henry's body. But the candle was incomplete, its wick melted down nearly halfway, its base slick with wax. Had it been lit that morning? No customer would have done so casually. Which meant it had been used before, perhaps for a purpose not entirely festive. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the bell, and a shiver ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from the echo of something forming in her mind. She turned it slowly in her hand. As she did, the bell gave a soft chime, and it was then, at that precise moment, that the memory clicked into place. She had heard that same bell yesterday, just before the scream, faint but distinct, a silvery note amidst the murmur of voices. And if she had heard it, then someone else had rung it. Near the body. At the time of death. She handed the bell to the boy behind the counter and thanked him, her mind already racing through the implications. Someone had met Henry near the candle stall, alone, intentionally. Someone had handled a lit candle, enough to leave wax on Henry's glove and scorch the ornament that had shattered during the altercation. Perhaps the candle had been used to distract or delay him, or to mask the real intention, whatever that may have been. And then, after the act was done, the killer had fled, not through the crowd, but through the alley, quiet and unseen, just before the alarm was raised. The village would go on speculating, of course. Dismissing clues as coincidence, or worse, explaining them away with careless certainty. But Miss Marple knew better. There were no accidents in murder. Only patterns, waiting to be seen. She pulled her shawl tighter and began the short walk back to her cottage, snow crunching beneath her steps, the sound of the bell still echoing faintly in her ears. Something was beginning to take shape. A motive concealed by holiday cheer. A weapon hidden in plain sight. And now, a waxen clue that pointed not to rage, but to ritual. The candle had been lit. The bell had been rung. But who had called Henry to his death, and why? Chapter 5, Alibis and Misdirection. There is something about a murder in a quiet village that unsettles the soul in ways no city crime ever could. Perhaps it is the intimacy of the place, the closeness of every cottage window, the familiarity of every face, that makes betrayal feel all the more personal. When a man is murdered in St. Mary Mead, it is not a distant headline, it is a rupture in the fabric of the ordinary. A tear in the tapestry of normal life, stitched for decades by routine and politeness, now frayed and darkened by suspicion. And in such places, the instinct is not to shout or accuse, but to tidy things. To sweep doubt under the rug with soft words and vague explanations. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime watching people cling to the illusion of order, knew better. When people are frightened, they either lie, or tell half the truth, and dress it in festive ribbon. The day after her discovery of the scorched silver bell and wax-stained candle, Miss Marple took her place at the edge of the square once more. The Christmas market continued, though now it felt more like a play staged for nervous villagers than a true celebration. The garlands were still up, the choirs still rehearsed, and the stalls still offered cider and cakes, but everything was touched by a slight unease. You could hear it in the pauses between conversations, in the way as darted and lingered too long on the mulled wine stall, still wrapped in twine and half-shrouded in gilt. It was on this backdrop of brittle normalcy that the alibis began to surface, some offered freely, others when prompted, all of them sounding just credible enough to keep the constable occupied, and the rest of the village guessing. Miss Marple listened to them the way one listens to a familiar melody played on a slightly off-tuned piano, knowing that what's wrong is not always the note you hear, but the one that's missing. Mr. Bellamy, the toymaker, was the first to account for his time. Or, more precisely, it was his neighbor who did. According to Mrs. Tyne, Bellamy had been in his workroom all morning, his curtains drawn, a pot of glue warming on the stove as he tried to repair the cracked leg of a wooden pony. The only problem was that Bellamy himself had not confirmed this, and no one had seen him leave or return from his home. The timing, he claimed later when asked directly, was a blur. He'd been in and out, fetching varnish from the back shed and sorting old orders. The implication was clear: he had been alone. Completely unaccounted for, except by his own recollection, and the faint smell of turpentine that still lingered on his coat. Clarissa Cray, the widow, offered a far more confident account. She had been, she said, stringing lights on the chapel's tree with the vicar's wife and a few other church volunteers. There were witnesses, at least 3 people who confirmed her presence for a portion of the morning. But when pressed about the specific time of Henry's death, somewhere just after 11, things became murkier. Clarissa, it turned out, had left for just a moment to retrieve a box of ornaments from the back hall. A brief absence, she insisted, no more than 5 minutes. But the back hall of the chapel, as Miss Marple well knew, led directly to a narrow path that circled behind the market, just steps away from the mulled wine stall. Not quite an escape route, perhaps, but certainly a detour with potential. And Clarissa's tendency to over-explain, to narrate each moment with too much emphasis, only made her alibi feel more brittle, not less. Then came Tom Fletcher, the baker. He was a bundle of nervous energy, offering flaky pastries with trembling hands, eyes darting like a hare caught in the open. His apron was stained, as always, with flour, but this time Miss Marple noticed something else. A faint reddish smear near the pocket, shiny and hardened like the edge of cooled wax. She inquired casually about it, and Tom, eager to dismiss suspicion, chuckled awkwardly and said it was from sealing a batch of spiced mince pies. He'd used a wax stamp, he claimed, to impress little holly shapes into the tops. Miss Marple smiled politely, but her mind filed the detail away. She'd eaten Tom's mince pies before, tender, sweet, and generously filled, but never adorned with anything more elaborate than a dusting of powdered sugar. A wax stamp on pastry. It struck her as fanciful and unnecessary. And unnecessary details, she had found, often disguised uncomfortable truths. Margot Thistle's alibi was straightforward and unsatisfying. She had been in the parish hall, she said, preparing the donation table for the afternoon charity drive. Alone. She had taken the box of raffle tickets, stacked the spare hymnals, and double-checked the tins for the coat drive. No one could confirm this, and Margot seemed neither troubled by that fact nor particularly eager to embellish her story. She simply crossed her arms, adjusted her orange scarf, and stated it with the confidence of someone who believes in the righteousness of her role. And yet, the missing donation tin still cast a long shadow over her words. Henry had accused her, gently, yes, but publicly, of mishandling the funds. It wasn't beyond imagination to think that someone so meticulous might take matters into their own hands to silence that sort of suggestion permanently. And then, of course, there was Eloise. The picture of calm, draped in her red wool coat with buttons polished to a shine. When asked about her whereabouts, she replied with elegant detachment that she had been at home wrapping presents for the children's orphanage. No one had been with her. No one had seen her arrive or leave. There were scraps of wrapping paper in the bin, ribbon on the floor, and a half-used roll of tape on the kitchen table. But all of it could have been arranged after the fact. Her alibi, while simple, was frustratingly airtight, because it was built on solitude and domesticity, the sort of setting that made suspicion feel almost rude. Who, after all, suspects someone with a spool of ribbon in their hand? Miss Marple, returning to her cottage that evening, stirred a spoonful of honey into her tea, and considered what she had heard. The suspects had offered alibis, yes, but shaky ones, easily unraveled or left purposely vague. Some had trusted too much in others' recollections, while others trusted no one at all, crafting stories that could neither be confirmed nor completely denied. And all the while, the small details, the scorch on the glove, the shattered ornament, the wax on Tom's apron, remained stubbornly out of place. She sat back in her armchair, the fire crackling softly beside her, and allowed herself a quiet chuckle. People, she mused, were very much like parcels, wrapped in bows and bright paper to present their best angles to the world. But shake the box gently, and you often heard the rattle of something they'd rather you didn't know. The truth, she thought, is rarely as neatly packaged as a gift box. And somewhere among the ribbon, the excuses, and the steaming cups of cider, someone was hiding a truth far more dangerous than they realized. It was only a matter of time before the paper began to tear. One of these alibis doesn't quite ring true. But which one would you unwrap first, and why? If you've followed the clues this far, you're clearly not afraid of a little snow, or a little scandal. Subscribe now to stay one step ahead of the mystery, because in St. Mary Mead, even the smallest detail can unravel everything. New twists arrive each week. Will you solve the next one before Miss Marple does? Tap subscribe, and let the sleuthing begin. Chapter 6. Ghosts of markets past the village of St. Mary Mead, blanketed beneath a pale sky and the hush of snow-laden rooftops, had the peculiar habit of turning memories into myths with alarming speed. Yesterday's quarrel became today's scandal and tomorrow's folklore. This was particularly true during the Christmas season, when nostalgia hung in the air as heavily as the scent of roasted chestnuts and pine. Old wrongs softened with age, traditions hardened into ceremony, and the market, more than anything, was treated like a sacred rite. But behind every string of lights and garland of holly, there were things better left in the dark. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the past, no matter how dearly remembered, has a way of creeping back when least expected, especially when someone tries to rewrite it. And in the case of Henry Ditchley, it seemed the past had come back with something far sharper than memory. It was just after dusk, the kind of hour where even candlelight seems reluctant, when Miss Marple wrapped herself in her thick winter shawl, tucked a torch into her handbag, and set off toward Henry's cottage on the edge of the village. The path was quiet, flanked by hedges glazed with frost, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of birds in bare branches and the distant clink of mugs from the market. Henry's house, Harwood Cottage, sat behind a gate swollen with age and paint, its windows dim, the front garden unshoveled since the snowfall. A perfect picture of abandonment. Yet the lights in the hall had been left on, likely by the constable, or whoever had first entered to notify Eloise. And as Miss Marple turned the knob and pushed the door open, she felt not the usual thrill of trespass, but the grave permission that death often grants to the curious. Inside, the cottage bore all the signs of a man who had tried to impose modernity upon charm. New books sat stiff and unread on the shelves. A tablet device, barely used, rested awkwardly beside a floral teacup on the coffee table. There were framed market flyers pinned to the wall, listing rules, improvements, and vendor assignments in Henry's tidy handwriting. Everything was too new, too arranged. As though he had been attempting to overwrite something much older, something that did not want to be forgotten. Miss Marple moved quietly from room to room, observing not just what was present but what was not. The kitchen had no smell of cooking. The desk, for all its papers, had no personal letters, no thank-you notes. Only forms. Budgets. Names. It was in a small wooden chest beneath the study window that she found it. A bundle of old correspondence, tied loosely with twine, letters dating back 3, sometimes 5 years. Most were benign. Inquiries from past stallholders, polite notes from suppliers. But one envelope, yellowed with age and handled often, had been tucked separately into a leather-bound appointment book. It bore no return address, only Henry's name in an uneven, slightly smeared scrawl. The contents were brief, typed in cold black ink. You may think this is your market now, but some of us built it with our own hands. Cancel my stall again and you'll regret ever setting foot in this village. Consider this your only warning. It wasn't signed, but the tone was unmistakable, personal, bitter, and written by someone who believed tradition was not just custom, but birthright. Miss Marple turned the letter slowly, noticing a faint waxy smear at the corner of the paper. She held it to the light. It shimmered faintly red, almost like the wax she had seen on Tom Fletcher's apron, or on Henry's glove. Her eyes narrowed, not with accusation, but with recognition. Whoever had written this hadn't just resented Henry's changes, they had considered them a violation. A betrayal of something sacred. She tucked the letter back into its envelope and continued her search, now more carefully. A small hallway led to Henry's workshop. A cluttered room, filled with account ledgers, boxes of decorations, and in one corner, a crate marked Vendor Records Archived. It was dusty, sealed with twine, and clearly untouched for months. She opened it slowly, flipping through lists of names. Many were familiar, long-time vendors whose families had worked the market for generations. But what struck her most were the annotations in Henry's neat script. Stall revoked, safety. Position reassigned, fees unpaid. Permit denied, no response. Stall after stall. Name after name. All methodically recorded. But was it method or malice? And then, at the bottom of the box, something else, smaller, tucked under a folded page. A candle mold. Simple, made of brass, and in the shape of a small cone tapering to a smooth round base. Miss Marple turned it over in her hand, noting the faint residue inside. A reddish wax, still clinging to the inner rim. She held the base near the light, and there it was. The same rounded edge she had seen scorched into Henry's glove. A perfect match. Not only had this mold been used to make one of the candles on sale at the market, but it had also left its mark, quite literally, on the victim. That was no coincidence. Her mind worked quickly now, knitting the threads. Someone had molded the candle, handled it while the wax was still hot, and handed it off to Henry in the moments before his death. Whether as a peace offering, a warning, or something far more calculated, the wax had transferred, first to Henry's glove, then to the broken silver bell beside his body. But the candle itself, its origin traced here to this very mold, was not the work of the new vendors Henry preferred. It was handmade, of the old variety. Crafted with care. Crafted with history. Miss Marple stepped back, letting the implications settle. What she had found here was more than a clue, it was a symbol. A physical artifact of tradition, wielded not as decoration but as weapon. And the letter, with its seething threat about stalls and territory, now spoke with greater weight. Someone had not simply resented Henry's presence. They had viewed him as a usurper. A thief of legacy. And they had warned him. He simply hadn't listened. She left the cottage silently, the candle mold wrapped in her handkerchief and tucked away in her handbag. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes catching in the lamplight as the market flickered in the distance. The bell tower rang 8 chimes, and the warmth of the village square, with its red ribbons and flickering lanterns, seemed somehow colder now, decorated, yes, but haunted. As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected not just on the evidence, but on the spirit of the market itself. This was not simply about competition or modernity. It was about memory. People had built their lives around this tradition. Passed down stalls like family recipes. Measured their years not in holidays, but in the space between one December and the next. Henry Ditchley had tried to revise all that. And someone had decided they would not let him. She paused at her gate, glancing back at the glow of the market behind her. Somewhere among the smiling faces and festive wreaths was a person willing to risk everything. Not for greed, not even for revenge, but to protect what they believed was theirs. A tradition, a legacy, a claim staked long ago in wax and garland and snow. Who would risk everything to protect a Christmas tradition? And how far would they go to defend the past from being rewritten? Chapter 7, Music Boxes and Memory. The winter wind drifted gently through the square, stirring the garlands that hung from the lampposts, and causing the thin chimes strung above the vendor stalls to jingle in discordant fragments of cheer. The market had settled back into a semblance of routine, but it was a brittle routine, delicate as spun sugar, and just as prone to cracking. Shoppers moved about more softly now, their laughter muted, their glances uncertain. Suspicion hung over St. Mary Mead like an invisible frost, and everyone, it seemed, had grown suddenly wary of standing too long in anyone else's shadow. And yet, amidst all the unease, one familiar sound stirred the morning air with unexpected clarity, a melody, lilting and precise, drifting from the toymaker's stall and piercing the village hush like a forgotten echo. Miss Marple had heard that melody before. Not merely in passing, but recently, just 2 days prior in fact. She had been walking through the square, knitting tucked under her arm, when she passed Henry Ditchley near the fountain. He had been whistling, absently and with surprising precision, a charming little tune she recognized from childhood, a waltz, delicate and melancholy, often played on music boxes given to well-behaved girls at Christmas time. It had struck her as oddly sentimental for a man so concerned with order and efficiency. Now, hearing it again, and this time from a mechanical source rather than human lips, Miss Marple was drawn irresistibly to the toymaker's stall, where the faint notes trickled out from a half-open lid like a message sent through time. Mr. Bellamy, the village's long-suffering toymaker, stood behind the counter, wrapped in a thick brown coat, spectacles fogged slightly, his fingers curled stiffly against the cold. His eyes, however, remained sharp as ever, tracking Miss Marple's approach with the precision of a man who had lived a long life learning that appearances were not to be trusted. The music box sat on a small velvet cloth near the edge of his stall, its carved lid partially opened, revealing a delicate ballerina slowly turning in place. It was beautifully made, crafted from dark wood and inlaid with flecks of silver that caught the morning light. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer, letting the tune settle into her mind. There was no doubt about it, it was the same melody Henry had whistled. Not similar. The same. And now, with Henry gone, the tune took on an eerie weight, like a riddle whispered just beyond the edge of comprehension. Bellamy, noticing her interest, gave a soft grunt and reached for the box, snapping it shut in one slow motion. But Miss Marple, ever gentle in her observations, noted something else. Not irritation, but something closer to anxiety. The kind of startle one feels when something they believed forgotten has unexpectedly returned. It was in Bellamy's hesitation, in the way he avoided her gaze, that Miss Marple felt a shift. When asked about the box, Bellamy gave a tight smile, and said it had been sold long ago, weeks ago, in fact. He spoke with confidence, too much perhaps, and gestured vaguely toward his ledger, saying it was already marked as cleared inventory. But Miss Marple, who had once spent an entire summer organizing her nephew's church records by hand, was not fooled by vague gestures. She requested to see the receipt book. After some protest, which he covered with a cough and much fiddling with his spectacles, Bellamy produced a small receipt ledger bound in worn leather. The truth lay in the ink. There it was, tucked between two entries for wooden trains and painted dreidels, silver music box with ballerina sold to see. Cray paid in cash December 18th. Yesterday. Clarissa Cray. Now that was curious. Miss Marple tilted her head, as though trying to recall whether Clarissa had ever expressed a fondness for music boxes. She hadn't. In fact, Clarissa was known to find such things fussy. So why, then, would she purchase such an item the very day Henry was killed, and more pertinently, why would she use her full name to do so, when the box had, moments ago, been found echoing a melody Henry had whistled himself? It did not add up. Unless, of course, it was meant to mislead. It wasn't lost on Miss Marple that the music box had been prominently displayed, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not. Nor did she miss the fact that Bellamy, a man known for his orderliness, had failed to remember selling it only the day before. That sort of lapse wasn't carelessness, it was fear. She thanked him politely and stepped away, walking slowly toward the center of the market, her thoughts churning. Clarissa had motive. She had quarreled with Henry. She had opportunity, those few minutes away from decorating the chapel tree. And now, it appeared, she had been linked to an object that Henry himself had last been seen associating with, musically at least. But Miss Marple, cautious and seasoned, knew too well the seductive danger of an easy connection. Things that appeared clear in mysteries seldom were. Truth liked to wear a veil, especially when red herrings darted about in festive disguise. Could Clarissa have used the music box to lure Henry somewhere private? Could she have given it to him as a peace offering, a nostalgic trinket with sinister intent? Or had someone else purchased it in her name, hoping to cast the first stone without getting their hands dirty? As she returned to the square, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the faces around her. Clarissa, chatting now with the vicar's wife, seemed unusually buoyant. Mr. Bellamy wiped his hands with a cloth, but not before glancing furtively at her retreating form. Tom Fletcher passed with a tray of warm scones, his smile brittle. And Eloise, gloved and graceful, stood alone by the charity booth, reading something folded and small. And somewhere in the midst of it all, that tune still played in her head, over and over, like a child's music box refusing to stop, no matter how tightly its lid was closed. This clue, she sensed, was not a smoking gun but a whisper in a quiet room, a fragment meant not to reveal the culprit but to distract from them. The melody had been chosen carefully. Too carefully. It was meant to be remembered. Which, to Miss Marple, meant it was being used not as a signature of guilt, but as a planted breadcrumb. As the cold wind stirred again and the church bells tolled the hour, Miss Marple turned once more to the edges of the square, her mind stitching together the familiar rhythms of deception. Someone, she was sure, had left that music box as a marker. Perhaps they hoped it would cast suspicion on Clarissa Cray, already so well known for her sharp tongue and public quarrels. Perhaps they knew Clarissa would bluster and snarl, and defend herself with such volume that she would only further incriminate herself. And perhaps that was the plan all along. Miss Marple smiled faintly, not with triumph but with recognition. This case was not about violence or passion, it was about theater. Whoever had orchestrated it understood their audience. They knew the characters in play, their temperaments, their reputations. And they knew that in a village where everyone knows everyone else's story, misdirection is most effective when it looks like truth. She walked on, the tune playing one last time in her memory. And in that soft, spinning melody, she heard not just a clue, but a confession. Just not the one anyone was expecting. The clues are falling into place, but the final twist is still hidden in the snow. If you've been following every glance, every whisper, and every candle-lit clue, don't miss what comes next. Tap subscribe now to stay a step ahead of the mystery. Because in St. Mary Mead, the quietest villagers often have the loudest secrets. Chapter 8. The pattern in the snow. By the time the 8th morning since Henry Ditchley's death crept its way across the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, the snow had begun to betray the secrets it had tried so gallantly to keep. It was the kind of crisp, quiet morning that wrapped the village in a deceptive hush, a pristine stillness, so complete it might lull the inattentive into believing that nothing had ever gone wrong at all. But not Miss Marple. She knew better than to trust a snowfall. For though it silenced footsteps and blanketed misdeeds, it also preserved things. It recorded the comings and goings of people in ways no gossip ever could. And so, while most villagers lingered indoors with warm slippers and stronger tea, Miss Marple made her way back to the market square, her eyes cast downward, watching not for faces this time, but for footprints. The cordoned-off mulled wine stall had now been left in a state of weary abandonment, its garlands drooping, the snow inside the ropes mostly disturbed, yet still revealing something far more valuable than first impressions might allow. Miss Marple, with her quiet steps and careful eye, moved slowly, measuring her every pace against the patterns pressed faintly into the frost. The square had seen many boots in the last week, vendors, shoppers, constables. But just beyond the outer line of trampling, she saw a series of prints that didn't quite belong. They were narrow, lighter than the stallholder's usual thick boots, and bore a faint tread with 3 diagonal grooves along the toe. Not workman's shoes, nor a shopper's heel. Not Clarissa Cray's pinched pumps, nor Bellamy's worn leather soles. No, these were precise, practical shoes, the kind designed for functionality rather than style or tradition. She followed the prints where they wandered near the stall's rear, pressed shallowly into the snow just before the alleyway. And then, curiously, she found a matching set looping outward, not toward the road, as one might expect from someone leaving a scene in haste, but toward the candle stall. The prints paused there, shuffled in place, and then, most remarkably, doubled back not toward the heart of the market but in a crescent arc toward the charity tent. Miss Marple's expression darkened only slightly, a small tightening around the mouth that, for those who knew her well, would have been the equivalent of a full gasp. She turned and made her way toward the charity tent, still standing near the chapel wall, its bunting a little faded and the donation tin now conspicuously present, but seemingly lighter than it ought to be. She stepped inside quietly. A single heater hummed faintly, melting away the cold, and the air smelled faintly of pine polish and sugar biscuits. Margot Thistle had always kept her charitable spaces meticulous, everything labeled, everything in a list. But lists, Miss Marple had long ago learned, could also be manipulated. On the main table sat a donation ledger, its cover cracked slightly with age but its contents meticulously updated. Or so it seemed. Miss Marple opened the book with gloved hands and turned to the page marked for December 18th, the day before Henry's death. There, written in dark ink, was an entry that stood out at once, not just for what it claimed, but for how it claimed it. Anonymous donation, £100, authorized by H. Ditchley. The sum was unusual but not impossible. What troubled her wasn't the amount but the signature. Miss Marple had seen Henry's writing on dozens of committee papers. Quick, confident, and always slanted to the right. This signature was too upright, too careful, the way one might write when trying to mimic another's style. And it lacked the decisive flick Henry always placed beneath his name. Forgery, perhaps, but why? Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the tin beside the book. She lifted it. The contents rattled, yes, but it was unmistakably light. The charity tin should have been nearly full. There had been a drive running all week, and generous villagers had donated regularly. She tipped the box slightly. Inside, a mix of small coins clinked softly against a few low-value notes. Far less than what should have been there. She lowered the tin, and let her eyes wander. There, just beside the heater, sat a pair of boots, neatly placed, practical, lined with fleece, and sporting a sole tread that bore 3 distinct diagonal grooves. She crouched down, ever so slightly, to confirm what she already knew. The pattern matched the footprints behind the mulled wine stall, and the route from the candle stand to this very tent. Margot Thistle had always been proud of her work, always above reproach, publicly anyway. But it was Miss Marple's quiet observation, often during the duller portions of council meetings, that Margot was not a woman who took slights lightly. When Henry Ditchley had questioned her handling of the donation tin just weeks earlier, albeit discreetly, in that careful way of men who thought subtlety excused insult, she had responded with a cold fury that lingered far longer than the moment required. Margot had accused him, though never to his face, of disrespecting her years of service, of undermining the very foundation of the village's charitable soul. And now Henry was gone, the ledger bore his signature without confirmation, and the donation tin was lighter than it should have been. The pattern in the snow told a story no one else had seen. Someone had approached Henry at the candle stall, likely with a gift, a peace offering, or a trap. He had been lured, perhaps gently, to the mulled wine stand, where a confrontation had occurred. The broken ornament, the scorched wax on his glove, the eerie sound of the music box. All distractions, well placed, carefully chosen. And then, after the deed was done, the killer had not fled directly. They had circled, returned through the maze of the square, and entered the charity tent calmly, changed their shoes perhaps, and resumed their role with practiced grace. Miss Marple stood in the doorway of the tent for a long moment, letting the warm air of the heater and the cold clarity of truth settle around her like snow on bare earth. She said nothing. There would be time for that. Time to speak to the constable. Time to confront. Time to let the trap spring as quietly and inevitably as the fall of frost from a pine branch. But for now she simply observed. Margot Thistle, she thought, not greedy, not cruel, but proud. Proud enough to risk everything to protect her reputation. And if that meant forging a signature, shifting a ledger, even orchestrating a murder that masqueraded as misfortune. Well, pride, after all, was a deadly sin for a reason. The snow never lies, only people do. The footprints point to the truth, but is Margot Thistle the one who left them? Or is someone else hiding behind her shadow? Chapter 9. The killer is caught by candlelight. Night fell over St. Mary Mead like a heavy curtain drawn across a well-rehearsed stage, and the village, clothed in fresh snow and flickering light, seemed as if it were holding its breath. The Christmas market sparkled as it always had, its stalls lined with cinnamon sticks, pine wreaths, and sugared almonds, but now there was a strange stillness beneath the glow. The laughter had returned, yes, but not without tension. It rang just a little too brightly, lingered a little too long, as though the villagers were trying to conjure joy from memory alone. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the square, gloved hands tucked into the pockets of her thick wool coat, watching it all unfold. She had seen this kind of merriment before, the kind that rose up like a defense against something too dreadful to name. But tonight there would be no more speculation. No more whispering behind curtains or sidelong glances traded over market stalls. Miss Marple had all the pieces now, each clue, like a dropped stitch, had been gathered up and tucked neatly into place. The patterns in the snow, the scorched glove, the music box, the ledger, all quiet pieces of a story most hoped would go untold. And now, under the soft, golden haze of lanterns swaying in the winter breeze, she would tell it. The gathering took place at the chapel hall, just steps from where the first scream had echoed a week ago. The hall was modest, wooden beams draped with paper stars, pews pushed aside to make room for folding chairs, and the fire crackled low in the hearth, casting tall shadows that danced across the walls. Miss Marple stood near the front, surrounded not by formality, but by familiarity. For here they were, the suspects, the townsfolk, and the curious Mr. Bellamy, looking thinner than ever, his coat buttoned high and his eyes nervously flicking toward the door, Clarissa Cray, chin lifted defiantly, wearing a hat one size too large, Tom Fletcher, pale and quiet, hands dusted with flour even now, Eloise Ditchley, Henry's niece, composed in her scarlet coat with lips pursed in an unreadable line, and at the far edge of the room, arms folded like a fortress, Margot Thistle herself. Miss Marple waited for silence to settle, then cleared her throat, not with theatrical pomp, but with the gentle precision of someone about to pour a cup of truth as neatly as tea. She began by tracing the events in order, not the chaos of hearsay, but the timeline the clues themselves had whispered. Henry Ditchley had been seen walking alone toward the candle stall shortly before his body was discovered. No one thought much of it at the time. It was a busy morning, the market full of distractions, music, chatter, and the comforting clutter of tradition. But it was in this moment, this carefully chosen, carefully timed moment, that the killer acted. The candle, Miss Marple explained, had been a handmade one, poured into a mold bearing the same dimensions as the scorch mark on Henry's glove. The candle had been passed to him, perhaps as a gift, a token of goodwill from someone pretending to reconcile a past disagreement. It was not the flame that killed him, but what came next, a mug of hot mulled wine, seasoned not just with cloves and cinnamon, but with a measured dose of sleeping powder. Enough to silence, not kill outright. Enough to ensure compliance. Then came the staging. With Henry barely conscious, the killer positioned him behind the stall, shattered an ornament beside him, and placed one of Bellamy's music boxes nearby, playing a tune that had once drawn Henry's attention. A tune he had been heard whistling in the days leading up to the market. The music box, Miss Marple revealed, had been purchased not weeks ago, as Bellamy claimed, but the day before the murder, paid in cash and recorded in the ledger under the name Clarissa Cray. But Clarissa, for all her bluster and petty grievances, would never have used her real name to buy something she intended to use in a crime. The purchase had been deliberate misdirection. It had worked to a point. Suspicion had indeed spread, first toward Clarissa, then toward Tom Fletcher, whose apron bore the telltale wax from the same candle mold found in Henry's cottage. But Tom's wax was culinary, and his alibi, though clumsy, was sincere. Bellamy had seemed a candidate too, his rage at being pushed aside by Henry simmering beneath the surface. But he lacked the precision, the orchestration, the need. The real trail led back to footprints. The same narrow soles with diagonal treads that looped from the murder scene to the candle stall, then back to the charity tent. And inside that tent, Miss Marple had found two more pieces of evidence, a forged entry in the donation ledger bearing Henry's signature, and a suspiciously light charity tin that had, days earlier, been nearly full. Miss Marple turned slowly toward Margot Thistle now, her voice as calm as ever. She did not accuse, she explained. Henry had discovered the irregularities in the charity accounts. Perhaps he approached Margot in private. Perhaps he threatened to raise the matter before the council. Whatever was said, it was enough to push Margot, a woman of impeccable appearance and carefully maintained public standing, to act. Not in a moment of rage, but with premeditated clarity. The sleeping powder. The forged ledger entry to cover a false donation. The manipulated details meant to point elsewhere. The use of Clarissa's name. All of it designed to keep Margot's hands clean while her position, and the illusion of her unblemished service, remained intact. For Margot, this had not been about money, not truly. It had been about pride. About control. About a tradition she had helped maintain, and a reputation she would do anything to preserve. Even if it meant turning the most festive week of the year into a puzzle of betrayal and deceit. As the last word fell from Miss Marple's lips, the room remained still. Margot said nothing. She did not deny it. She did not cry. She simply looked at the fire, as if seeing something in the flames that only she understood. And when the constable finally stepped forward, slowly, as though treading upon glass, she rose, smoothed her scarf, and went quietly. Miss Marple did not smile. She never did in such moments. But there was something in the way she folded her hands, in the soft sigh that escaped her lips, that suggested not satisfaction, but relief. The kind that comes when truth, however bitter, finally comes into the light. Outside, the snow had begun again, fine and glittering beneath the lanterns. The market would reopen tomorrow. The bells would ring. And life, as it always did in St. Mary Mead, would carry on. But for now there was silence, a silence not of fear, but of understanding. The mystery may be solved, but in St. Mary Mead, another secret is always just around the corner. Don't miss the next twist, the next clue, or the next clever deduction. Tap subscribe now and join Miss Marple on her next case, where every whisper matters, and nothing is ever quite what it seems. Chapter 10. Tinsel and just as snowflakes danced lazily across the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, soft and silent, covering the village in a glistening quilt of white that looked almost too perfect to touch. The chapel bells tolled gently in the distance, their sound more hymn than alarm now, and a subtle stillness had settled over the Christmas market. The chaos of the week had melted, if not entirely away, then at least into something manageable, something the villagers could speak of in past tense, even if their voices trembled slightly when they did. Behind every stall now, behind every cup of mulled wine and every tray of mince pies, there was a renewed sense of watchfulness. After all, once you discover a murderer in your midst, even a small, snow-covered village begins to feel like a stage full of masks. Miss Marple, however, had removed the final mask. And she had done so not with confrontation or drama, but with soft-spoken clarity, like someone setting a final stitch into a long and careful piece of embroidery. The scene at the chapel hall had not erupted into panic, as it might have in some stories. No one screamed. There were no chases through snowdrifts or gasps of disbelief. Only the heavy quiet of truth settling into the room, the way snow settles into crevices no one thought to look at before. The constable, bless him, had taken a moment longer than necessary to step forward, and Margot Thistle, proud, intelligent Margot, had made one last attempt to untangle herself from the net that had so efficiently closed around her. She spoke with precision, as always, reminding the room of her years of service, her tireless dedication to the parish, the market, the orphans, the widows, the sick. She appealed to the villagers' memories, their gratitude, their loyalty. But it was no use. The evidence was too tight now, too cohesive. The candle wax matching the mold found in Henry's home. The wax smudge on the forged ledger. The donation tin, suspiciously light. The footprints marked in the snow by her own boots, with their distinctive diagonal treads. And above all, the calmness with which she had tried to weave it all into a story where she remained the hero. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that villains often told the most convincing stories. Margot's voice wavered only once, when she realized that Eloise, Henry's niece, was no longer watching her with polite neutrality, but with quiet disappointment. That, it seemed, stung more than any accusation. Once she was escorted away, the room emptied slowly, like a theater after the final curtain. No one knew quite what to say, and so, mostly, they said nothing. A few nodded in Miss Marple's direction. A few glanced away. In St. Mary Mead, gratitude was rarely spoken aloud, but it hung in the air all the same, like the scent of nutmeg that lingered long after the pie was gone. Miss Marple did not linger in the hall. She stepped out into the clean, bracing air and walked home as she always did, her stride steady, her eyes observant even in solitude. The walk from the chapel to her cottage was not long, but tonight it felt somehow softer, as though the village had exhaled. Beneath her feet, the snow crunched with each step, and above her, strings of golden fairy lights twinkled along the eaves of each house, glowing like tiny guardians of the peace she had helped restore. Her cottage, as ever, welcomed her like an old friend. The fire had kept its promise, crackling quietly in the hearth, and the kettle on the hob offered just enough warmth to fill her favorite teacup. She poured the Darjeeling slowly, added a thin slice of lemon, no sugar, and settled into her chair by the window. Outside, the village square was beginning to empty. The last of the shoppers were making their way home, scarves pulled tight, packages tucked under arms. The lights would stay on a bit longer, of course, and someone would surely forget to unplug the music box at the toffee stall. But the market, for all its merriment and murder, had endured. Life in St. Mary Mead, for all its undercurrents, would go on. Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes fixed on the flicker of candlelight in the frosted glass, when she noticed the envelope resting neatly beside her knitting basket. It had arrived earlier, slipped through the door without ceremony, and had been entirely forgotten during the day's revelations. She opened it now with quiet interest. Inside was a folded sheet of cream-colored stationery, bearing a familiar script. "Dear Jane," it read, "I hesitate to trouble you during the holiday, but something odd is happening at the manor in Devonshire. Old Lord Canterfield has fallen ill, suddenly and mysteriously. And last night, someone broke into the family vault. Nothing was taken. At least, nothing obvious. But the servants are whispering, and Lady Canterfield refuses to speak to the police. If you happen to find yourself free after Christmas, might you consider a visit? Yours, as ever, Charlotte." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it once more and set it beside her teacup. A slow smile touched her lips, not giddy or expectant, but quietly satisfied. She had always believed that mysteries, like weeds, had a way of sprouting wherever human nature took root. And Devonshire, with its misty hills and ancient secrets, would be as fine a garden as any. She picked up her needles then and resumed her knitting, the rhythmic clack of wood on wool a comforting contrast to the memories of wax, forged names, and poisoned wine. There was comfort in the ordinary, in tea and tinsel, in the ticking of the clock and the promise of the next story waiting just beyond the horizon. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentler now, wrapping St. Mary Mead in a peace that felt earned. And somewhere beyond the hills, the manor in Devonshire waited. Did you suspect Margot all along, or did someone else fool you completely? Share your thoughts below, and be sure to join Miss Marple on her next case, where secrets lie even deeper. And the snow isn't the only thing covering the truth.